welcome to a new episode of In Other Words with Danielle and Zara.
So this is a podcast where we talk about a wide variety of different subjects, from health to abuse. So in other words, we talk about all the things.
So we are very excited for these next couple of weeks. We are starting a new series, 3-part series.
Wow.
We're calling it Mental Health March because we are in the month of March.
That's so appropriate.
And I really dig the alliteration.
Very good.
So yes, I think mental health is something that's very important and needs to be talked about, and we're going to try not to just say things that you've heard a million times or make it a very generic kind of thing.
Yeah.
So hopefully what you hear will be helpful and enlightening.
Indeed. So in honor of Mental Health March, we're promoting today that you go and speak to your friends about your feelings.
Yes.
Let's not do any of this hiding how we feel. We're not doing
agree.
that.
Yes.
So Zara, how are you?
I am well. I'm well. I won't lie, this week was a bit of an up and down week.
Is it? Why?
Yes. I don't know, I just felt a little bit, not overwhelmed, but I had this moment where I was like, wow, being in ministry is going to be really difficult.
Oh yeah.
And there are questions
Sorry, was it all my questions that I was asking you?
a little bit.
Yeah. Well, that's how I feel as well. I'm like, like, oh, it's too much.
Yeah, and just realizing you aren't going to please everyone. I had
or
a
have all the answers.
good reminder of that this week.
Yeah.
But otherwise, I'm well.
That's good.
How are you?
I'm good. I'm very hot today.
It is hot.
It is a very hot day today, but it's going to be even hotter tomorrow. We are recording this on Saturday, the 27th of February.
Yes.
Which is crazy.
It's going to be 37 degrees Celsius tomorrow.
I know. But other than that, I'm well. I have had my occasional existential crises. You know how it be.
It happens at least once a week.
Yeah, it really does, and that's okay. And I have an assignment due on Monday, but it's not a big one, so I'm not too worried, you know.
Okay.
And I've already thought about it a lot,
Good.
so that's half the work done, you know.
Exactly.
All right, shall we
Okay.
get into it?
Yes. So something that I felt I wanted to address, and this be the kind of main topic for this episode, is understanding the difference between mental health and mental illness.
Okay.
So do you want to kind of chat about what your understanding of the difference is?
Okay, so when you first told me you want to discuss mental health versus mental illness, my immediate thought was oh duh, it's kind of self-explanatory, you know. You're if you don't have a mental illness, then you're mentally healthy, and if you have a mental illness, then you're mentally ill.
Unhealthy.
You know. So that was my initial reaction. So I was like, okay, whatever. And then I was just thinking about it, and I think the idea is that mental health encapsulates a bunch of different factors, you know. Mental health is not just the absence of mental illness, it's also taking care of yourself, you know. How can you function in society? Can you function? And that also just brings me to my point that even if you have a mental illness, you can still function. Yes. Obviously, if you're not being treated for something serious, then it can be very debilitating. And that's for me, it's what mental illness is, when you have, let's say, depression or anxiety, or maybe something like schizophrenia, even something like that. If it goes untreated, can be very debilitating. You won't be able to function or do anything in society, really. So I think that's how I understand it. But I mean, if you do have something and you are being treated, you're taking care of yourself, then you can still be mentally healthy. Yeah. And
yes. Well, the first thing that I wanted to say was that 20% of people, all people, suffer with a mental illness.
Yeah.
And 100% of people have mental health.
Yeah.
Just as we have physical bodies, we also have minds. And if you don't have a mind,
I don't know how you're living.
that is worrying. But I think that it is important that people talk about mental health from the lens of let's look after ourselves emotionally, intellectually, spiritually.
Yes.
So you eat when you're hungry, and that's how you sustain yourself. A lot of people exercise because it's important for your physical body.
Gotta get that dopamine.
Exactly. And it's the exact same with your mental health.
Yes, 100%.
You need to look after it. And so how do you do this? I think something that is important for me is I believe that it really is about self-awareness. You are the only person other than the Lord that really knows what's happening inside of you. And so I think people who are less self-aware or emotionally immature will likely be mentally unhealthy.
Okay.
So when it comes to looking after your mental health, talk to people.
Yeah.
Figure out how you're doing. And even like us starting this episode saying, how are you? That is so important. And I look at, I think Meghan Markle wrote an article not too long ago. And her main point was just ask someone how they are. Because you never know. And something that we need to understand from the get-go is that, and this is how you explained it, a mental illness is debilitating. You struggle to function in society. And going through an emotional trauma or a difficult emotional period is normal.
For
it doesn't mean that you have a mental illness.
Exactly.
So you can see a mental illness, it's a biological, it's a physiological issue, whereas just not being in a good space,
it's a normal thing.
And so how I best explain it is, let's just say something bad happens. So you lose a loved one or you go through a breakup. Two people might go through a very depressive stage or just feel very down. Someone who does not suffer from a mental illness is able to deal with those emotions, work through them in their own time. Everyone's difficult. Everyone is difficult.
That's true.
Everyone is different, but they will be okay. Whereas someone who has a mental illness and is not being treated for that, the loss of a loved one or something like this can be completely destructive.
100%.
And also often how you will identify the difference between someone who is just struggling emotionally versus someone who has a mental illness is generally there's usually a subconscious reason for why you're feeling the way you're feeling. Whereas someone with a mental illness, you do go through periods where your emotions and your behavior don't really have a solid or rational reason.
100%.
So yes.
And I think it's also important, when it comes to speaking about people, and you have to realize that just because someone is happy or someone appears happy, it doesn't mean that they don't have a mental illness,
Exactly.
Someone can genuinely be happy, but they can still have depression, for example. And you can't just dismiss these things because that's impossible because look how happy you are, because that's just not how it works. The human mind is so complex.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think with that, should we maybe speak about the dangers of self-diagnosis?
Yeah. So this is quite a common thing. And I mean, I'm sure everyone has heard when someone wants something to be neat, or when someone wants everything to look nice, they say, oh, well, I have OCD, you know? And when you say things like this, or let's say someone is a nervous person, or I don't know, they get nervous for something, so they say, oh, well, I have such anxiety. And it's you don't have anxiety, you just are anxious, you know? And I think this is quite dangerous because it also perpetuates stereotypes about these 100%. Diseases, and a lot of people just throw around these terms, OCD, very schizophrenic, loosely. Bipolar, when they don't even know what they actually mean. So for example, OCD, it's obsessive compulsive disorder. And so this means often people will literally have these obsessive thoughts going around their heads, if I don't touch that doorknob 20 times, then my family is going to die. That's literally what these people think.
Hectic.
And obviously everyone is different, so two people who have the same mental illness can have different symptoms.
Exactly.
And I think it can often mean that people don't take these things seriously. And I think that's one of the most dangerous parts of it, because you're just throwing around these terms and it becomes just a normalized thing, And I mean, talking about mental illness should be normalized, but not to the extent that it's not a serious thing anymore. Yes.
Yes, I think there's a big danger when you feel depressed and then you say you have depression.
Yeah.
For example. And I think just remember the internet is a very dangerous place.
Yes.
And I promise if you put your symptoms in, you can have every disease on
100%
on the planet.
Yes.
And so it's so important that if you are struggling or you just reach a point where you've talked to people or, you know, you've done what you can and you're still feeling ill or still feeling down, that you go and seek professional
100%.
help. But yeah, just don't put your symptoms into Google and make a rash decision. Like, I look at something like, what is it? Oh, like, let's just say you're feeling depressed and it's ongoing. It has all the marks of like having like depression as a mental illness, but it could actually just be your thyroid.
Oh, hectic.
So unless you have your thyroid checked, it's not necessarily a mental illness. It just is. Often it's you have an issue with your thyroid and that can cause
rough.
Yes. And also something that I think we don't understand is that yes, mental health, often people say your mental health is the same as your physical health, and yes it is. However, we also have to understand that we are a human being. Like, our bodies and our minds are still one thing. So if your mind isn't healthy, your body isn't going to be healthy, and vice versa. And everything that happens in our body is going to affect our mind. So for example, something that it doesn't frustrate me. I get that people joke about it, but like PMS, it is a real thing.
It is a real thing.
There are hormones working in your body, and
it's normal. Nothing to be ashamed of.
Exactly.
Stop shaming people.
Exactly. You can feel more emotional, more irritable, and that is a hormone thing. So don't immediately feel like something's wrong with me.
No, but can I tell you? Like, I was speaking to this with my cousin Larissa. Shout out to you if you're listening. But there'll be times in the month, obviously, and maybe this is TMI, but I don't really care. It's important to talk about.
Exactly.
Where I genuinely feel so down, like nothing is ever going to get better, like, oh, I can't even remember when I was happy kind of vibes. Then the next I'll get my period and I'm like, oh, and you'd think I'd learn that's what it means, but it doesn't. And I'm always like, oh my word, like, what is wrong with me? And then I get my period, and it doesn't mean that those feelings like don't count, so that they like unreasonable, because those are thoughts that I do have every now and then, and that's just how it is. But it just becomes like really elevated when I'm at my time of the month, you know.
Exactly. So that is a normal thing. There are a lot of reasons why we feel the way we feel. And with that, I do want to talk specifically about teenagers. Okay. Because even like we were in high school not too long ago.
It feels like a lifetime ago.
And just from that point to now, like, mental health has become something that people don't want to talk about, because we become like teens specifically have become anxious about anxiety.
Oh, hectic.
You know what I mean? It's like everyone just seems to be mentally ill, and I've seen a lot of people react where it's like, oh, they're just a teenager, they need to get over it, or oh, they're just looking for attention. And here is the thing that I find needs to be addressed, is that oftentimes, or just in high school, there is so much stress that comes with high school, being on social media, watching things that aren't healthy for you. All of these things make being a teenager, where you haven't emotionally matured yet, so difficult to handle. And someone who is mentally ill versus someone who is just going through a difficult time may show the same symptoms. Either way, they're still having a difficult time. So if a teenager, you know, is just wanting attention, there's a reason for that. So still speak to them. They might not be mentally ill, but they still need the help. And something I've learned is, you know me, and I was an emotional wreck when I was a teenager. And it just helped knowing that people were there to help me. And now as a youth leader, I often see teens who will come to me and speak about things, and as an adult I'm like, get over
like
yourself.
being so dramatic, but at the time it feels like the end of the world.
Exactly. And that's something we need to understand about people's emotions, that everyone is difficult, and when you are a teenager, problems are going to seem bigger than they are, and just let people feel their feelings. Even like, this is so off topic, but you know, when we had to do the comparative essay in high school, where we had to compare which was worse, the apartheid or the Holocaust in terms of people suffering. And I did my essay where I said, like, you can't compare people suffering because you can't.
No, you can't.
So understand that everyone
Your
is
feelings
difficult.
are valid.
Exactly. And yes, there are teenagers who think that having a mental illness is cool or the thing to do, which we will talk about in a second. But there will be many who that's not the case for them, and if we dismiss everyone, we could really be missing out on people that need serious help.
So basically, don't dismiss people's feelings. Be open to chatting. And also, I think, like, even if you don't have a mental illness, and we'll probably speak about this in the third episode a bit more, but like, it doesn't mean that you can't go for therapy. Like, sometimes you just need to go and like chat it out with a professional.
That's the thing, like the emotional issues that a person with mental illness versus a person who's not mentally ill, it's still the same emotional issues. We're all living in the same world. We're all gonna have struggles in our life, and we need to talk about 100%. them. You don't need to have a mental illness to look after your mental health.
Amen, sister.
Yes.
Okay, so now we spoke about this just now, the romanticization of mental illness.
Romanticization, is that a word?
In my opinion, it should be.
Now it's a word.
Surely it is romanticization. Anyway, like, this has become a very common thing, and I'm sure it has. I wasn't alive back then, so I don't know if people did it, but it's something that you see quite often, you know, especially on social media. People will go on about how they're depressed and how they have anxiety, but it's not in the sense of like asking for help. It's in the sense of like, look how quirky I am, you know. And I think it's also, it's just quite uneducated. And this goes back to like self-diagnosis, you know, because a lot of these diseases that are seen as being like cool, quirky to have are genuinely awful, debilitating things. They're not cool to have.
No, so if you're watching like videos where people are talking about their story, not from a perspective of, I want you to know that you're not alone and everything's going to be okay. Often it's from a place of woe is me. And that just feeds into this idea of like, I kind of want to be sad. Like, you know what I mean? It's
I know exactly what you mean.
And I just think it's so dangerous because like mental illness sucks. There's nothing cool about it. There's nothing romantic about it. It sucks. You know, so you'll see these montages on YouTube with like Lewis Capaldi playing in the background, and it's like, oh, my life is over. Or you'll see like community pages on social media. It's like depression awareness or support group, but it's not, there's no support. It's more just like, life sucks. And yes, you can feel like that, seek help, but also remember that you have a 13-year-old girl who had a fight with her parents and now she thinks she's depressed and the world is over. So
it's a thing. But okay, how do you think that like media such as, for example, 13 Reasons Why, or you're talking about All the Bright Places, how do you think they have perpetuated like the romanticization of mental illness and even of suicide? Like, what do you think?
So I'll speak specifically about All the Bright Places because I've read it, and then you can speak about 13 Reasons Why. But All the Bright Places is basically about this teen couple, and both of them suffer with mental illness, and that's what kind of connects them. And yes, sure, it really helps, and it can bring people together because it's so much easier to talk to someone who knows what it feels like. But essentially it's like, wow, we both like don't want to be in this world, and like the way they feed into each other's illnesses, like they bring each other down. It's almost like it's two people drowning
and they just
trying to save each other. That's not going to help. And at the end of the day, I almost feel like they push each other into like further darkness. But it's kind of made aesthetic in a sense. Like it's just become this trend of like illness is beautiful. It's not.
Yeah.
It sucks. So that is my issue. So I mean, it's a beautifully written book, but I'm just seeing it like play out in how people look at mental illness now, like specifically people who don't suffer from mental illness, which is I think what turn a lot of people off is they see it from this perspective and then they think that mental illness doesn't exist at all.
Yeah, that's true.
Which is the difficulty. So it's just this whole idea of like, it's good to have a mental illness. It makes you different. And some people feel like then they can be a mental health advocate, which is dangerous.
Yep. But yeah, I mean, with 13 Reasons Why, we spoke a little bit about this. We spoke quite a bit about this in our episode on death, so go check that out.
Yes.
But my problems with the book and the series is just how it, I mean, especially with the series, I've only watched the first season. I haven't watched the other ones because I'm really not that interested. But it's just like the suicide of this girl is really made out to be this very like romanticized thing, and I know like it's probably not their intention, but that is just often what happens with like teen dramas. And I don't think I will go too much into it because I actually just had a thought now about like some of Billie Eilish's songs. Now if you listened to this podcast, you know I love Billie Eilish.
I do know that.
But like just some of her songs, I think she does have depression, or she did have. So obviously as a songwriter you do write about your own experiences, and I think like what the problem can be is like some of her songs, like I think this is one called Listen Before I Go, beautiful song, like devastating as well if you just listen to the words. And I think maybe someone who's like not as old and wise as me like might listen to this kind of song and think like, oh, suicide is like this beautiful thing and all of that. And I mean, I don't think Billie Eilish wrote this in that way to romanticize depression or suicide in any way. It's just kind of like how an artist puts out their feelings, you know. But that is just often what happens. It becomes this very beautiful romantic thing, which people need to be careful of. And there's always, I don't know, always just remember like, oh, it's actually not, it is actually serious, it's actually horrible, let's not wish that upon myself. And then you can still appreciate these things. I think, like, I'm not saying, oh, don't watch 13 Reasons Why, because at the same time a lot of people have found like it to be a helpful series. But those are just my thoughts on that whole thing.
I agree.
And like we already said, speaking about mental health and mental illness, it's become much more normalized. But do you think there's still a stigma around mental illness?
I actually think so. I think people still feel like, okay, we can talk about it and it's an issue. But I still think people don't take it seriously just because they don't understand. Yeah,
that's so true.
So here's the thing. I think a lot of people, when it comes to mental illness, often the thing is like, I just have a chemical imbalance. You hear that. It's a saying. But no one really knows exactly what that means. And I would suggest actually going and looking at how the brain of someone who's healthy and someone who has a mental illness looks different. And we will talk about treatment in the future and just how medication helps your hormone levels like incredibly. But I just think people need to understand that it is real. There is people who study to be a doctor and then specialize in cardiology. The people who study to be a doctor and then a psychiatrist have studied the same things. They're not stupid people. It's not going to go away.
It's not some abstract kind of thing. Like, they are legitimate physical things that happen in your brain to make you feel that way.
So a mental illness very much isn't like, your environment only plays so much of a part. It can push you over the edge, but
I know exactly what you mean.
Mental illness is still an issue, and often that can be biological, genetic. So often you'll see that if someone is schizophrenic or bipolar, chances are that later generations will be as well. So that's something to take into consideration. Often people their brains haven't developed because of trauma or whatever at a stage where your brain was supposed to develop. So there are a lot of actual medical reasons, and it's important that you remember that. And so you don't just dismiss
exactly.
illness.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, I mean, it's also the reason that a lot of people are scared to say, oh, I have this mental or personality disorder or whatever.
Yes.
You know, because they're scared of how people react. And I think often it is the case where people will tell, someone will tell another person, oh, I have anxiety, or I have depression, or etc., etc., etc.
Yes.
And then that person will then treat them differently for it, because it's like, well, I don't know how to treat a depressed person.
Yes.
Just treat them like a normal person. Like, they will deal with it. Just be open to talking.
Exactly.
And I think really that is what the most important thing is, just to talk to people, get an understanding. Like, don't just dismiss these things because of your own limited understanding.
Exactly.
And like, the reality is, if you are a mentally healthy person, if you don't have a mental illness, then like, you will never truly understand what it is like. You can feel down and you can feel anxious, but I don't think, like, I will never know what it's like to be like properly, like, have anxiety. Like, I do get anxious, but I don't have anxiety, you know?
Yes.
So yeah.
And then I think one thing that I just wanted to get across, because you said personality, just interesting, because I'm going to talk about it in the next episode, but a mental illness is like a physiological thing. Personality disorder is a product of some sort of developmental phase in your life. So your multiple personality disorder or narcissistic, etc. A lot of that will come through because of experiences people have gone through, and often personality disorders and mental illnesses will go hand in hand, which makes for life to be so much more difficult.
I know.
But I just wanted to end with some advice on how to be self-aware with your mental health, regardless of how old you are, who you are, whether you are mentally ill or mentally healthy, is something that I find. There's so many apps, and often when someone tells you to journal, it's like, oh, dear
what
diary. The amount of journals I started as a child.
Same.
And then like, I did this today. This person did that today. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm saying at the end of every day, look back, rate your day from 1 to 5. There's an app it's called Dailyo. Okay. Not sponsored. But it's really good. Rate your day from 1 to 5. Choose one word to describe your day. And then like, I'll often just put a verse of scripture there just to kind of remind me. In case I'm not in a great space, just remind me that like, God is still good. But often you'll see, like, if you've had a bunch of bad days in the month, then you know, okay, something's wrong. I need to sit down and talk to someone and figure out what's going on. So
that's a really good idea.
Yes, because we also, when you have your period, put that in there so you can figure out what's going on. It's not something to obsess over, but it's just really helpful that you know how you're feeling, because if you know how you're feeling, you can actually deal with it. That also, I think, comes down to like spending time with yourself. You know, like, often when people are feeling down or whatever, they like to look for lots of little distractions, you know, spending time with people, or just watching a ton of series or watching a ton of movies. I mean, we all do these things. We do.
But it's so important sometimes to sit down with yourself and say, hey, like, what the heck is going on? And spending time with yourself is good. You're going to be stuck with yourself for the rest of your life.
You are indeed.
You got to look after yourself. I think that covers everything we wanted to talk about today.
Yes, this was just a good introduction.
And do you want to just mention what we'll talk about next week?
Yes. So, guys, I'm very nervous.
You got this.
About next week's episode, but I also think it's important.
It is.
So I'm just going to share my story, my mental health journey. It was a very long and roller coaster of a ride, and praise the Lord for where I am here. But I want to kind of let you in on just how it felt and the journey that I took. So that'll be an interesting episode.
It'll be a good one for sure.
And then in our third episode, we're going to talk about treatment.
Awesome.
So our thoughts on meds and therapy, and how can you be mentally ill and say you trust God? And how can I help a friend or a parent who has a mental illness? So that'll be our third episode, but I think it's going to be a good series. But
guys, thank you for listening. And if you want to chat about anything, you don't know who to chat with, you can
please
message us.
DM us. And also, something that I want you to understand is we aren't professionals.
No.
We don't talk from a place of like, I know everything, because we don't.
No, I took 1 year of psychology. That's as far as it goes.
I took counseling.
Yes.
And that's it, you know. So yeah, we don't have all the facts, but we're just thinking of these
and we're here to listen.
Yes, and we want you guys to be thinking and talking as well.
Indeed.
So, yes.
And we will see you next week.
Yes. Like, subscribe, do all the things.
All the things. Cool.
Bye.
Bye.